In this lesson, mostly static pages, we're going to start building the real sample application that we'll be using throughout the rest of this tutorial. From now on, everything will be done more or less industrial strength, to the extent that we do anything that isn't exactly the way you would do it as an experienced Rails developer. It will only be a temporary difference in order to make it easier to learn. But this is a real application we're going to be building. And we're going to start with something very simple, which is the idea of a static HTML page. And then we'll add a little bit of a dynamic content. So Rails is designed for database-backed web applications, but in fact, Rails is great at this kind of mostly static website as well. In fact, the Rails tutorial website itself is almost completely static, and it's a Rails application, and I found it very convenient for that purpose. One thing to bear in mind in this lesson is that there is a lot of code, and we saw quite a bit in the last lesson as well. At this point, it still is not the kind of thing you should worry about if you find it confusing, especially with respect to the tests that we're going to be writing. So there's a lot of syntax going on in this lesson, and we'll be talking a lot more about the syntax, especially the Ruby language itself, in the next lesson. There's a chance you might start getting bogged down with all of the code in this lesson. In that case, I recommend just typing it in and trying to get it to work. And you might find that you're amazed a few lessons from now, looking back, and you'll realize, wow, I actually understand all that code now. Let's get started as we have in previous lessons by creating a new application. I'm in my projects directory here. I'll just print the working directory. And I'm going to use the Rails new command again, as usual. So I'm going to call this application sample app, and I'm going to do one thing differently from the previous times that we did Rails new. I'm going to pass an option to skip test units. By default, the Rails new command generates a test directory for tests, but we're going to be using a different test framework called RSpec that uses a different directory. So I'm going to do skip test unit. Now let's cd into that directory, sample app. And now I'm just going to run Sublime Text on the current directory, sublime dot. Our first step in this case is to update the gem file for the sample application. Let's open it up. Let me show you where it is. It's actually just in the root directory, gem file. And in order to get the sample application to work, we need a whole bunch of different gems. Now, ordinarily, when developing, you'll usually just add one gem at a time as needed. But in this case, I think it's more convenient to start with all of the software needed for this tutorial. In particular, I've assembled a list of the gems up on GitHub, and I've given it a permanent URL. So what you should do is, instead of using what I happen to paste in right now, you should go to this URL and install the gems from there. So let's take a look at that. This is the file, and let me show you the URL. It's at bit.ly. It's bit.ly/Rails tutorial gem file. This just forwards to this GitHub page. If you followed the advanced setup screencast, you've already done this once. So let's just copy this. I don't know why I did that. I could just have done Command A, Command C, and Command A. Oops. There we go. Just paste it in, and let's run bundle. You might have to do without production here, because of the PG gem, which is for PostgreSQL. But my system has it, so I'm just going to type bundle. There we go. And there's one more little piece of setup that we need. We're going to be using RSpec, and in fact, we just installed RSpec. You can see here we're using RSpec. So let's generate some files that RSpec needs. And the way you do this is Rails generate RSpec :install. All right, so we've got all the files we need to get started. Now I'm going to put the project under version control. Again, this step is optional, but it's a really good idea. And let's take a look at the .getignore file. Remember, it's just right here. And let's add DS store. And I think that's the only one I need, so let's close this down. Add everything here, and then make our initial commit. Now let's push our code up to GitHub. We need to create a new repository first. Let's go to the page here for new repositories. Let's call it sample app. All right, and then we're going to say anyone can see it. Let's create a repository. And as usual, GitHub gives us some instructions about what to do. So for an existing Git repository, we're already in the right directory, so we just need to add GitHub as the remote. Paste that in, and then git push u dash u. So git push it up. And while it's doing that, we can click on continue. And there we go. Repository was successfully created. And even at this early stage, I want to deploy the application. It's a good practice to deploy early and often. It's amazing how many things go wrong if you develop for a long time locally and then try to deploy the production application only much later. All kinds of horrible things can happen just in terms of the complexity of dealing with a new environment. So it's a good idea to start deploying essentially as soon as we start developing. Do Heroku create and then the Cedar stack. And now we need to push up the code. Git push Heroku master. For subsequent pushes, you'll see that you can actually leave off master. Just say git push Heroku. In fact, I have an alias on my system. Deploy. It just says git push Heroku. I deploy so many things to Heroku. All right, at this point you might notice that we actually do have the URL here. This is the Git URL, and if you look back at where we did the Heroku create, Heroku actually told us what the public URL was for our application, but it's hard to remember that. You know, it's just words and numbers together, and it's sort of annoying to have to remember that. It is here locally on the system. There's a place, if you look in the .git directory, and look at config. Actually, I'm going to do this. It has the severe cloud 9709 in my case right here. And so it's just that.herokuapp.com. But that's annoying to have to remember that. And so Heroku gives you a nice tool to not so that you don't have to remember the URL. You can just type Heroku open. And what that does is open the application in the default browser on your system. And so here you can see that we've got our initial application, and this is essentially what we did in the first lesson with the first app, and we can reproduce the error message here. There we go. And remember, that's expected behavior, is no big deal. So as we continue throughout the rest of the development of the sample application, I'll be deploying this sample app to Heroku. Of course, this is an optional step, but I think it's really exciting to see your application come to life on the live web. There is one more thing I'd like to do. If you look at GitHub, you'll notice that we still have that default README, this useless README here. So I'm going to change that to something useful. So first I'm going to change its name with git move. I'll change it from readme.rdoc to readme.md. Remember, this md is markdown. So GitHub will infer from the file name extension what the content is, or what the format is. So this is good. Let's open it up. And I can just remove that, and let's say that this is the Ruby on Rails tutorial sample application. Okay, that's good. Let's take a look at the changes we made. We can do git status. So there's a change to be committed, which is the moving of readme.rdoc to readme.md. So it's the rename, right, renamed here. And then there's a change that's staged. That is to say that Git knows that we've made this change, but it's not going to be part of the commit. So we do need to add that somehow. We can do that with the -a flag. That's commits all, and then the message. Improve the README. Oh, it should be improve the README. Remember present tense. Push up to GitHub. Take a look at this, and we can reload this, and we should see the new README. There it is. At this point, we're ready to make some static pages. There are two main ways that Rails can make static HTML pages. The first and very rare way is to make raw HTML itself in the public directory. And the second way is to use the Rails views, which is the main way that you would ever make static content in Rails. But just to get started, let's take a look at what's involved in making a truly static HTML page here in the public directory. You can see that there are several HTML files already, including index.html. Let's take a look at that. Oops. If you take a look at this, it says Ruby on Rails, welcome aboard. And if you go down here, it says you're writing Ruby on Rails. So at this point, we identify this HTML page as the static page that we see when we just look at the default Rails application. Let's take a look at that. This is the one at Heroku, but we can look at the one on localhost here. Oops, we're not running a server. Let's do that. There we go. Let's reload this, and we can see welcome aboard. If we go to the URL here, we can type in index.html explicitly, and you can see that nothing changes. So this is in fact the page that we were looking at, and it even says it here. In order to make a real application, we're gonna have to delete this file, which the default page tells us to do. So in order to see how to make a raw HTML file, we're going to create a new file in this public directory. I'm going to call it hello.html. This is essentially hello world. We're going to start by defining a doc type. The doc type identifies the kind of document, and in this case, this is an HTML document. And this very compact way of stating a doc type is characteristic of the latest HTML standard, HTML5. Now what I'm going to do here is called a tab trigger in Sublime. I'm just going to type HTML and then hit tab, and it fills in a bunch of the structure that's common to HTML documents. So here we've got the HTML tag, and then a head tag, and then the title tag. So let's inside the title tag, let's type greeting. This is our hello to the world, and I'm just going to tab in here, and this is another tab trigger P, and then tag makes a paragraph tag, and I'm going to say hello world. And I like the nesting to be a little more explicit, so I'm going to just move this guy over and this one as well. Oh, and actually, we want HTML to be at the same level as the doc type, so let's just go down and move the whole thing over. As far as the browser is concerned, all of the white space is ignored. It doesn't matter. But for the purpose of parsing this visually, it's really nice to have the indenting look good. So let's take a look at the browser again. And now instead of index.html, we're going to go to hello.html. And there we go, hello world. Right here we can even make it a little bigger. That may not be very exciting, but it's certainly proof that we're doing something on our local machine that is able to be served up by Rails. But we're not going to use this hello.html file ever again, so I'm going to remove it. The next step is to use Rails views to create static HTML. And the first step in this case is going to be to create what's called a controller, which we saw briefly in the last lesson, to contain these pages. So let's start with a Rails generate command. Before we did Rails generate scaffold, but in this case we're going to generate a controller just by itself. The scaffold command generates a whole bunch of things that we don't actually want. And we're going to call our controller static pages to emphasize that it is used only for static pages. So static pages. And one of the things you can do at the command line is put in the names of some of the pages that you want. In this case, we're going to make a home page for our application called home. And we'll also make a help page. Now I'm going to hit return here, but this is actually an error. And it's unlikely at this point that you'll be able to figure out exactly why unless you've read ahead in the book. But this is going to be a useful exercise. What happened here is that we generated a bunch of files, including some spec files that we don't actually want. In particular, there are these spec view files, for example, that it turns out, if you've read the book, you know that I don't particularly like these view files. There are a bunch of reasons I don't like to have separate view specs. But I don't want those files. And in previous editions of the Rails tutorial book, I removed these by hand. But it's much cleaner simply not to generate them in the first place. And there is a way to do that. There's an option you can pass to Rails generate. The problem, though, is that in order to do that, we need to reverse what we just did. And you can see that there are all these files. This is really annoying. And this is something you might very well run into when developing Rails applications, which is why I want to mention now. Every time there's that you generate something, you can destroy that same thing just by typing Rails destroy. It's essentially the inverse operation of the generate command. So it will not only remove the controller in this case, but all these auxiliary files that we don't want. So let's do that. We don't need to say home and help because those are inside of the controller and they'll get removed automatically. There's a second reason that it's nice to destroy the results of generating a controller, which is that we really would like to work on a separate branch. Remember in the first lesson that we made a branch just to create a new README file. In this case, we're going to be doing quite a bit of work separate from the default application. And so it's a good practice to work on a different branch until we're confident that we've made changes that are worth keeping. Let's take a look at the status. Look at that. So it looks like the Rails destroy didn't actually undo everything. Well, you know what? Let's just leave that directory there for now. It's okay if there are no files in it. They won't get run. I mean, there's nothing to run. What's the difference in the config/routes? This is a useful command, git diff. Oh, look at that. So it didn't actually undo everything. It's unfortunate. All right. Well, I'm going to open up this file. We'll learn about this in just a moment. Actually, remember what we did. In the first lesson, we learned about how to undo changes in a particular directory using version control. So let's add all these changes. Git add dot, and then I'm going to do git checkout, and then -f for force. There we go. So nothing to commit, the working directory clean. See what I wanted. So now let's check out a new branch for making static pages. Git checkout -b, and then the name of the branch. You can use an underscore there between static pages. For some reason, I like to use the dashes for Git branches. And now let's do our Rails generate. There's a home and help. I'm going to put a backslash in to continue to the next line. and I'm going to pass in an option, no test framework. This will suppress the generation of the files that we don't want. Let's take a look at what we did there. See, there are quite a few new files, including a modification of this this routes file. So let's take a look at that. We saw that briefly before. So there's our routes file, and if you want to see where it is, I can just open up the sidebar here. It's in config routes.rb. The two lines here give us a hint about what we've just done. The first line says get static underscore pages slash home. The second says get static underscore pages slash help. Here the word get refers to the kind of request that this page responds to. A get request is the kind of request that happens when you just click a link on a browser or put the URL directly into the address bar. So let's take a look at that first page, static underscore pages slash home. This is localhost 3000 static pages slash home. And there we see the default home page. This is the page that's created by the generator, and it's in the static pages controller, and it's the home action. And then it gives you a hint. It says find me in app views static underscore pages slash home.html.erb. So let's take a look at that file. Let's navigate to it directly. So it's in, let's take a look at it again. It's an app views static underscore pages home.html.erb. So it's an app views static pages home.html.erb. And we can see here that this is just the HTML for this web page. Let's take a look at the controller as well. It's an app controllers static pages controller. There we go. And here we see that there's a Ruby function defined by this def keyword that we'll be learning more about in the next lesson. And then we've got home and help. This is a Ruby class. If you've studied object-oriented programming, you'll have some idea of what that means. And in the last lesson, we talked a little bit about the idea of inheriting from the application controller. One of the things that you might notice if you've studied programming languages before, especially something like Ruby or Python, is that if you were to make these function definitions and just leave them blank, they wouldn't do anything. And yet in Rails, they do something. And it's a consequence here of inheriting from the application controller. This is one of the reasons that I think that if you really have a primary interest in making web applications, that you don't necessarily have to study a lot of Ruby or Python or some other language before starting. Even though it certainly is helpful to have some background, it can be quite confusing because this looks like it does nothing, but in the context of a Rails application, it does quite a lot. And in particular, when we visit this URL here, /static pages /home, it gets routed into this action. And the default behavior for an action like this is to render as HTML the corresponding embedded Ruby page. That's what this .erb here at the end means in this file name. So home.html indicates this is an HTML file, and the .erb means embedded Ruby. But if you look at this page, you might notice that in fact there's no embedded Ruby at all right now. It's just a static page. This is just HTML. Over the course of the rest of this lesson, we'll change this situation and actually have some dynamic content in these pages. Before moving on, if you're using Git for version control, you should follow along with me and make a commit. It's a good idea to make frequent commits when developing software, but as I mentioned briefly before, throughout the rest of this screencast series, I'm not going to do lots of commits because I think it would break up the flow of the discussion too much. But for now, I want to show you the kind of commit you might very well make if you were doing this for real. Let's take a look at what we've got. We've got a bunch of untracked files here, which is an indication that we need to add them to the repository. We can't use the -a flag to git commit in this case, we need to add them explicitly. So git add dot adds them, and then I'm going to commit them with the message add a static pages controller. At this point, it's possible actually to push this branch up to GitHub as something other than the master branch. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to continue making changes on this local branch and then merge the changes in at the end into the master branch before pushing up to GitHub. If you're going to be using a branch for a lot of work that you're afraid to lose, it is a good idea to make a remote branch that you can then use to track your changes and have a remote backup as well. If you're interested in doing that, do a web search on creating a remote branch with Git. Of course, for the real application, we don't want a placeholder page like this, static pages home, find me in the location of the file. So in this section, we're going to start changing over these files, the home file to start with, and then the help page that we made at the command line. And we're not only going to fill these in with more useful content, but we're going to proceed using test-driven development, which means we're going to write automated tests for what we want the application code to do before we write the application code itself. We'll be using a technique called integration tests, which give you a nice high-level way of testing the behavior of an application. In the context of the RSpec framework that we'll be using, these are sometimes called request specs. Incidentally, I don't know the origin of that term, but that's what they're called. So if you need to do web searches, sometimes including request specs will help you. I mentioned the word behavior there. We're going to be focusing on the high-level behavior of the application for the most part in our testing. And in this context, test-driven development is called behavior-driven development. It doesn't really matter that much, the distinction between the two, but this is a really nice approach to developing software that it tends to be much less error-prone and much less brittle than software that doesn't have tests. It's important to note in this context that when you're first developing an application, and especially when you really don't have an idea of exactly what it's supposed to do or what the problem space looks like, test-driven development is not necessarily the best tool. It's often a good idea to do what's called a spike, where you just go flat out, try to basically get an idea of what the application is supposed to do, and then later on go back and rewrite it using test-driven development. Once you've basically gotten the shape of an application, it's a lot easier to rewrite it. In fact, you don't even have to rewrite it completely. You can do what's called refactoring, and we'll be talking about that a lot throughout the rest of the course of this tutorial. Our first step is going to be to change this home file, this home.html.erb, to have content that's more appropriate for the beginning of our application. Well, we'll be customizing this page extensively throughout the rest of the tutorial, but for now we just want to have it give the title of the application and also have some information about what the purpose of this page is. In order to get started with this, we're going to generate an integration test for our static pages. So let's do that at the command line here. We can type Rails generate and then integration test with an underscore. And then the name of the test. We'll see in a moment that this will automatically append the word spec, so we're going to just say static pages and hit return. You can see here that it generates a request spec, and it's in the spec request folder called static pages spec.rb. So let's take a look at that. For now, I'm going to use the sidebar, but ordinarily I would navigate using the find everything command. I'll switch over to that incrementally throughout the rest of this tutorial. Okay, here we've got the spec directory, spec requests, static pages spec.rb. I'm going to replace this interior code here, and I'm also going to change this just to static space pages. So describe static pages do end. Now, this is pure Ruby, but even if you've studied Ruby before, this might not look familiar. RSpec exploits the malleability of the underlying Ruby language in order to define a domain-specific language, or DSL, for doing testing. The best way to learn the syntax is by osmosis. You just need to use it, and eventually you'll see the patterns. I'm going to be using some commands, including what are called tab triggers here in Sublime Text that are specific to my setup. If you'd like to try to replicate this setup, I recommend going to the Advanced Setup section of the Rails tutorial book, Chapter 3 on static pages. There's also a free screencast that covers some of this material as well. This file is designed to describe static pages, and we're going to have a nested describe block in here. These are called blocks. Whenever you see a do end, it's a specific Ruby construction called a block. And we'll be talking a little bit more about this in the next lesson. So we're going to make another describe block for the home page. And at this point, we can decide what we want the home page to look like. I'm going to use an it block here. It should have the content I'm just going to say that I think this page should have the content sample app. This is just a way to get started. We're actually going to make more specific tests later on. But for now, this is a good start. The stuff inside the green here is just a string. It's not actually code. Incidentally, the syntax highlighting doesn't quite work here. It's a little annoying. This should be orange, and I haven't figured out how to get that to work. But the do is part of the block structure, and the stuff inside here is just a description. This is for the purposes of documentation. Now we're going to be writing some Ruby code, and we're going to use a method called visit. This is part of the Capybara gem that we installed at the beginning of this lesson. Capybara, incidentally, is the successor to a program called WebRat. I think the name WebRat inspired Capybara. Capybara is the largest rodent. So this visit method is part of Capybara, which works really nicely with RSpec. So we're going to visit the page that we want to test. So let's take a look at that. Here's the page, and let's just copy this just to emphasize that we're really just visiting this page inside the test. I'm going to put it in single quotes. Double quotes would work here too. We'll talk more about that in the next lesson. So we're going to visit this page, and then we're going to say something about what this page should look like. We're going to just say page dot. This is something that comes for free as part of our test setup. Page dot should, and then I'm going to use what's called the have content method. Should have content sample app. And save that. Now I'm going to run the test, and at this point, since our home page does not have that content, it should fail. Let's run the test at the command line. In this context, we need to run the rspec command, and because of the way bundler works, we need to type bundle exec before it. So rspec is a command line command, and we want to run it on this file, spec requests static pages spec.rb. And there we see that there's a failure, that the page should have this content, but it doesn't. So let's add that content. Put this in here. And I'm going to add some other content as well. Now, it's always an art to figure out exactly what you should be testing for. So in this case, I'm essentially testing for the title, and then I'm going to put some copy here in the paragraph tags, and I'm not going to test for this actual content. All right, at this point the test should pass. Let's go take a look. Just do an up arrow and rerun it. And there we go. We now have a passing test. And in fact, let's take a look at the actual page. Refresh it just to be sure. There we go. Now that might seem like an awful lot of trouble for such a simple change, but one of the cool things about test-driven development is that you get into this cycle of red and green. You get to red, as indicated here, a failing test is in red, and then you make some application code and get to green. And you can get into a really nice flow state this way, where there's this cycle, red, green, and then when the application code starts to get a little ugly, you can refactor. And it's great to have an automated test suite when you're going to do some refactoring. When refactoring means that you change what the code looks like without actually changing what it does. Of course, it's that latter part that's the real trick. Being able to change what it looks like without changing what it does is very difficult, and so having a test suite to catch any bugs you might introduce in the process of making changes is really valuable. Now, you might not be all that impressed by this workflow that I've used so far, and it is a little cumbersome to have to switch to the command line to run the tests. And in this context, I really like to use a package for Sublime Text that lets you run the tests from within the editor. That's included as part of the advanced setup. So I'm going to implement that now for my local machine. At this point, if you want to follow that advanced setup, you should be able to come fairly close to replicating what I'm about to show you. All right, I've just gone through this setup on my local project, and one of the main consequences of the setup I just made is that I've installed something called Spork. This is a new tab that I have for running the Spork server. So let me show you what that means. I'm going to quit out of Spork right now. And let me run the tests again. You might notice I've stopped using bundle exec. That's because I've configured my system so that I don't need it. Again, this is covered in the end of chapter 3 and in the free screencast on advanced setup. It's giving me a warning here that no distributed Ruby server or DRB server is running. That's because I've added an option to my .rspec file telling it that it should expect a Spork server somewhere. And you can see that there was quite a bit of overhead. It takes some time to get started. So what Spork does is it gets rid of that overhead. I'm going to run Spork. So it's preloading the Rails environment. And now, if I run it again, it's really fast. So the amount of time it takes in terms of this finishing statistic is just depends on how fast the machine happens to be running. But there's this overhead that you don't have to deal with, and that's particularly useful because oftentimes you'll just be running one test at a time, or maybe just one test file. And in that case, the overhead of just starting up the Rails environment is a substantial fraction of how long it takes to run the test. So let me show you this here. This is now using a package for running tests inside of Sublime Text. I'm just going to run this one example. So I'm going to place the cursor here and then run one example. So you can see it executed almost immediately. And down here on the lower left, you see one example, 0 failures. This one example in green, 0 failures in red. By the way, this color here is a custom color. Out of the box, this package actually uses a slightly different color, but for the screencast I really like it to be red, and just in general I prefer that color. So this is covered in the advanced setup as well. To show you how this red-green cycle works, let's go back and break our application. Now this is a nice little trick. I can rerun the test I just ran using Shift-Command-E. So the test you run with Shift-Command-R runs just one example, and then you can do Shift-Command-E to rerun the last examples you did. So I broke the test, and now I'm going to make it pass again. So let's go through that cycle again for the other page that we created, the command line, the help page. Let's take a look at the current state of the help page. Let's see where it is. It's in app, views, static pages, help.html.erb. And let's write our test for it. It's just going to be the exact same thing. I'm just going to copy this here. It's going to say describe help page. See if you can guess what it should be. Oh, I shouldn't put that twice. Should have the content help, and we can go to visit static pages help. You can see that you don't actually have to know the code all that well to be able to guess the changes you want to make. And say the page should have content help. Save that, and now I'm going to run this example with Shift Command R. And we have a failure, which is good. That's what we expected. And now we're going to go over here, change this to help. Notice it is case sensitive, and it's because the string help lowercase did appear. By the way, this is the right place to go if you want help on the Rails tutorial. It's at railstutorial.org/help. There's a lot of material there that'll give you hints on how to debug your application and where to go for further assistance. There's also a full reference implementation of the sample application. I don't recommend using that in general. You'll learn a lot more if you type things in yourself, but it's a really good tool for tracking down discrepancies. And I want to indent this a little bit. This is a useful way to format the code, just to have one level of indentation there. And now remember, Shift Command E will rerun the tests. And there we go. One example, 0 failures. It's a good idea when you reach a natural stopping point to rerun the entire test suite. And the way to do this is at the command line. So you can rerun the entire test suite by typing rspec spec. And you just give it the directory, and it runs all the tests in that directory. Now, right now, there's only one test file, but this is a good practice to type rspec spec. Remember, you might need to type bundle exec, but I've configured my system so that I don't have to. There we go. Now, typically on a website such as the sample application we're building now, you would want more than just a home page and a help page. There are a couple more pages you might want. We're going to add one of them right now and then a second one later in the lesson. The first one we're going to add is an about page, a page that discusses, about us, describes what this application is. And we're going to add this page using test-driven development. So let's take a look at this. Probably guess what the test will look like. Just copy it. Describe about page. It should have the content about. Actually, we're going to, as a variation on this theme, we're just going to say about us, just to show that it doesn't have to be exactly the same as the name of the action. View static pages or visit static pages /about. Should have content about us. So let's run that example. We've got a failure. Let's take a look at what it is. So the failure here says that the about page should have the content about us. That's just from these strings that we put in here. But then it has an error. It says that when it visits static pages about, there's a routing error. No route matches get static pages about. So that's a big hint about what we need to do. We need to change the routes file. So the routes file is in config routes.rb. And you can probably guess, just based on this code here, what the new route should be. So let's add another route. Let's add a route for the about page. Save it and rerun the test. Okay, so this is a trick that it's important to know about if you're using Spork. If you look at this, it's actually the exact same error. There's still a routing error. There are a few files where if you change them, you have to restart the Spork server. Remember, the way Spork lowers the overhead of running the test is by preloading a bunch of things. One of the things it preloads is the routes. So we have to restart the Spork server if we're using Spork, which I am. So let's... and there are so many different times where this happens that I used to try to tell people when it's time to restart the Spork server in the book, but there's just so many. You just have to get to the point where you'll see this kind of thing where it's like, wait a minute, I just added a route and it's giving me the same error, and then you're like, oh, that's right, I have to change this or restart the Spork server. All right, so now let's run the tests. Okay, so it's still failing, but now we've got a different error. Now it says the action about could not be found for static pages controller. Okay, and that's not surprising because we don't have such an action. Close this down. But we do need the static pages controller here because what we're going to do is add an action in parallel with the other two. You can just save that and rerun the test. By the way, if you were curious in previous lessons why I had this 2-panel display for the code, this is why. It's because I like to bounce back and forth between the test code and the implementation. This is a really nice setup, I think. Okay, that's good. It's a different error. Now it says action view missing template. So a template is essentially what a view is. So what this is saying is that there's no view called, there's no view corresponding to about. Now remember that the view corresponding to help is help.html.erb, for home is home.html.erb. Right in here. So that means we need to make a new file called about.html.erb. I'm going to make a new file here and save it into views, static pages, about.html.erb. Save that. Rerun the tests. And now we've got an error. We still have a failure, but it's another error. Now it says page should have content about us is failing. So it's got a template, but it just doesn't have the right content. So let's put that content in. We can save it there and rerun our tests. And there we go. One example, 0 failures. So we've just added an about page to our application purely through test-driven development. So we haven't even looked at the browser. And it takes some practice to get to be able to do this, but once you learn how to do this, it's an incredibly powerful way to develop software. Of course, it's still a good idea to do a sanity check and see what the browser tells you. Let's look. So we want to go to the About page. And there we go. It is working. I'm going to hit Escape, by the way, just to get rid of this, this output window. So far, all of the pages we've made have been static HTML. And in this section, we're going to add a little bit of dynamic content. In particular, we're going to have a title that changes on a per-page basis. So take a look at the web browser. There's an annoyance with Chrome that it doesn't actually show the title, so I'm going to use Firefox for this. We're at localhost 3000 here, and let's go to the home page. can see that the title here is just sample app. Let's look at help. Also sample app. So what we want to do is change that title and tailor it to each page. Let's get started by writing a test. We're actually going to use a different way of testing. Here we use have content, but it's actually better to do a more specific test. There's another related method called have selector, which is really equivalent to just saying have tag. Used in earlier version, I think in WebRat it's have tag, but Capybara uses have selector. And in this case, you give it the name of the tag. So if you look at the home page, I'm just going to use find anything. You can see that the sample app title or the sample app heading is an H1, the top level heading. So let's say H1. And then you give it an option. We'll be learning more about this. This is a hash. We'll be learning more about this in the next lesson. So we've got that, and we can do the other two. Just replace these. And let's run the whole test suite, or at least it actually is the whole test suite at this point, but we're going to run the test in this file with Shift Command T. There it goes, it passed. I'm going to move this down. And now we're going to add analogous tests for the title. So let's think about what we want this title to be. Page should have selector, title tag, and let's talk about what the text is. I'll show you in a minute what I'm about to do. So this is text, and I want to give it a base title. Ruby on Rails tutorial sample app, and then I want a specific title for this page. Let's call it home. Now, you might notice that what's happened here is I've gone way off to the right, and if you look down here, you can see that I'm actually in column 94. I really can't stand this. I'm a devotee of the school of thought that says you should stop at 80. This is the traditional width of old school terminals, but it turns out to be a really great way of enforcing discipline on programmers. If you have to go much further than 80, then you can probably change your code in some way to make it more convenient. And in fact, in this case, we'll see later on that we're going to replace this base title with a helper method. So having the code run more than 80 columns is a hint that we should probably be designing this slightly differently. But at this early stage, I don't want to cover topics that are a little more advanced than they really should be at this point. So we'll start with this. Oops. Oh, all right. No, actually, I did this wrong. This should be in its own it block. There we go. And then I can copy it. Oh, and we actually do need to visit the page here. Let's get rid of some white space here. So this should be static pages help. And we should change this. So anytime you see this kind of duplication, it's a hint that you're probably going to want to change it at some point. Also, this copying and pasting is a bad sign. It means that we should probably be doing something slightly differently. But at this early stage, this is fine. About us. So that is 81. So we're in column 81. So we just made it with 80 columns there. That's great. So let's run these tests. We should be red. Good. 3 failures. And now for the purposes of what we're about to do, I actually want to get rid of something that Rails now puts in by default. This didn't used to be generated by default, but it's so instructive to get rid of it and then put it back that I'm going to cheat a little bit here. There is what's called an application.html.erb file, which is a layout. And I'm going to rename it to something, and then we're going to restore it at the end of this lesson. So I'm going to move app views layout application.html.erb, and I'm just going to call it foobar and put it in the current directory. To the effect of this, if we reload this, now there's no title here at the top. So we're going to put that title in, and we're going to put in some additional HTML structure while we're at it. So let's go up here. We're going to give each of these pages a doc type. And we're going to say that it's an HTML tag, HTML, and that was a tab trigger. And I'm going to put in the title. And inside the body, I'm going to put this here. Ordinarily, I would do some indentation, but we're actually going to be undoing all of this in a moment, so I'm not going to bother with it right now. So let's rerun the test and see if that did anything. Look at that. Instead of 3 failures, we have 2. So that's a good sign. Let's go to the About page here. Same thing. I can just copy this. That I'm copying this is also an indication that we probably are missing an underlying abstraction. But this is a good place to start. If this looks ugly to you, it should. This is terrible what we're doing. But this is the first step, and we're going to get the test to pass. So we started at red, then we're going to get to green, and then we're going to refactor. So I'm going to open up the help page with Find Anything. You can see it does give you the location app view static pages help.html.erb. Okay, there we go. Oh, and I think I forgot the doc type here. Oh, yeah. Let's put this in here. That's a little application called Jump Cut for OS X, by the way. It's really useful. Put this in. Save everything. That's Option Command S in Sublime Text. And now let's rerun the tests. Oh, 1 failure. So I thought we might have been green there. Oh, I put about instead of about us here in the title. Okay, so now we've gotten to green. At this point, the code is working, but from an aesthetic point of view, it's really disappointing. We've got all of this duplication. And if you look at the structure of these pages, the structure is almost exactly the same. You can see that what varies is this little piece here. There's a base title, and then there's a custom title, a page title that changes on each page. So the way we're going to eliminate this duplication is actually to increase it slightly. We're going to make these pages exactly the same, apart from just 2 elements, rather than almost the same. So the way we're going to do that is using a method that's a little bit advanced, but this is the standard and correct way to do this in Rails. We're going to use a Rails method called provide. And as part of this, we're going to see our first example of what's called embedded Ruby. This is Ruby code that can be included inside site templates. And the way that we're going to use this provide method is to put it inside this angle bracket % construction. What this does is just executes the Ruby code that it encounters, and provide is defined by the Rails framework itself. So we're going to provide a title. This weird looking thing here is what's called a symbol. We'll be talking about that more in the next lesson. And then we're going to give it the name of the page. So in this case, it's going to be help. And then we're going to replace this section with a closely related form of embedded Ruby. Instead of just percent, the angle bracket percent, we have angle bracket percent equals. The difference is that this code just executes the Ruby that it finds inside. This code executes the Ruby inside and then inserts the result into the site template. Well, in general, it will be the site template. In this case, it's just the help template. As you might guess, that we're actually going to be hoisting this up into the site-wide template. The way that we insert this help is using a keyword called yield. This is a little more advanced than I would like to introduce this early in the game, but this is the right way to do it. And it used to be a little bit more intuitive, but Rails has been changing things over the past few years. This is it makes sense if you understand what's going on under the hood, but at this stage you probably don't. But you can probably see from this the pattern how it works, or at least how to replicate it in these other templates, and which is what we're going to do in a moment. So there's this provide. Essentially, what's going on here is we're saying, okay, Rails, there's going to be a title called help, and then later on, we want to insert that title here. This may be a little confusing, but let's just make these changes, and by running our test suite, we'll be confident that we've actually done something useful. Let's look at the other examples. Let's just copy this. Copy this. Provide title. This is the home page. Yield the title in there. And the same thing on about. About us. Now let's run the test suite. And there we go, it's still green. So that shows that what we just did actually works. And let's just do a sanity check. Refresh this. There we go. Ruby on Rails tutorial sample app, help, up here at the top. You can go to about. And the same thing. Now we have the right title and also the right heading. Now if we examine the structure of these templates, we can see that everything in here up to the body tag, from doc type to body tag, is exactly the same. And the closing tags are also the same. We can just go back and forth to the 3. So the only thing that's different is this first line that gives the title, it provides the title, and then the body is different. So there's a standard solution to this in Rails called layouts, and we talked about it briefly before. Let's move foobar back to where it started, which is app, views, layouts, application.html.erb, and let's open up that file. There it is. So if you look at this file, this is a layout for the entire application. It's got the doc type here, it's got the title tag, it's got this a couple of lines that, or it's got 3 lines that we'll be talking about more later in the tutorial that come standard as part of the Rails generate. And then it's got this yield here. Now you might recognize yield. Here we yield title. That inserts into the template the string that we defined here. In this case, the yield without an argument automatically inserts into the template everything in this file. So in particular, here we don't want to have all of this doc type stuff duplicated. So what we want to do is take this part that's the same for all 3 of our pages and stick it in where we have a title here. I'm going to give us some indentation here. take a look at this. Now we can get rid of all this structure. Get rid of that. Get rid of these tags at the bottom. Same thing here. We can just get rid of all this. All this duplication is just going to go away. So this might seem like magic, but one of the things that Rails uses is this idea of convention over configuration. And the convention is that if you have a file called application.html.erb, that it's automatically used as the site template. It's the layout for the whole application. And let's save everything, and now let's rerun the test suite to see if we're still green. And there we go, we are still green. So what we just did is we refactored the views to get rid of the duplication, and we put the duplicated code into the application layout. Also take a look at the file. Here we go. If we actually look at the browser, and so on. So it's still working, and because we have this test suite, we can be confident that our refactoring worked. We can't prove that it worked, but it's certainly a lot more likely. That brings us to the end of the main material in this lesson. Just as a way of solidifying what we've done, I'd like to solve one of the exercises from the book. We're going to add one more page, and in addition to home, about, and help, we're going to add a contact page. And as you might guess, we're going to use test-driven development to do it. So see if you can figure it out. We're going to copy and paste here, and we're just going to use this model to make a contact page test. So let's go look at this. Should have the contact. And actually, instead of content here, I actually wanted to say that it's the first level heading. So let's do that. And replace all in this file. Right, let's change this text to contact. Change this to contact. We should have two failures. That's right. Good. So that the two failures are the failures in here. Actually, boy, there's a lot wrong here, though, isn't there? Contact. This should be contact. And this should be contact as well. So we still should have two failures. Let's rerun it. There we go. So those two failures are from these guys here. By the way, looking at this, you might notice just how much duplication there is. We're visiting the page in both places here. We've got this this base title that's common. We'll be fixing that in later lessons. All right, so let's add a new contact page. Remember what we did before. If you want to get a hint about how to proceed, you can look at the error messages. So remember the way we start is with a new route. This is the routes file, config/routes. Copy it there and say static pages contact. And here we're going to have to restart the Spork server, so I'm going to do that. Rerun the tests. Still two failures, but it's a different error. If you scroll up, you can see it's a different error. It's going to complain about a lack of an action, which we can put in here. Def contact. You can actually leave off this action, but I really like the idea of having one action for each page, or at least when you have static pages like this. Now it needs a site template. So we're going to call this not a site template. We need a page template. So it's going to be in static pages. It's going to be called contact.html.erb. Let's put some content in here. So let's save that and rerun our test suite. One failure. Ah, very good. So I thought we might have been green there, but I forgot something. My test suite told me. What we're missing here is the title. So what we need is the provide. So let's put that in. By the way, that shortcut there is not inside of Sublime Text by default. That's another thing that you can install as part of the advanced installation or advanced setup. Provide title, double quotes or single quotes both work here. But I'll try to be a little consistent. There we go, contact. Now let's rerun the test suite. And there we go. We've now added a contact page, and our test suite is green again. Let's take a look at the contact page. There we go. At this point, we're ready to make a commit to our application. And before making a commit, I usually like to rerun the full test suite just for sanity's sake, really for paranoia's sake. Our spec. There we go. So we're green. Of course, in this case, there's only one file, and we already ran the test suite in its entirety inside of the editor. But I think it's a good practice. It's a good habit to establish even at this early stage. See what the status is. We see a bunch of modified files, a bunch of untracked files. Your results will vary here. Remember, I did some advanced configuration, so things like the .rspec modification and the modification to .getignore. You probably won't see those unless you followed the steps in the advanced setup. So let's get add dot. We finish the static pages. That completes that commit, but of course we're still on the static pages branch. So let's go to the master branch and merge in our changes. You can check out master, and then the command is git merge. And the name of the branch, static pages. There we go. If you're using GitHub and Heroku, it's a good idea now to push things up, so let's do that. I'm pretty paranoid. I'm going to run the test suite one more time after the merge. Good. This pushes up to GitHub. And this pushes up to Heroku and deploys the application. Oh, but it didn't. That's really weird. Okay, so this is a debugging opportunity. I'll show you how to get out of this trouble. There's a file called .git/config. Let's take a look at it. That's weird. I thought I set this thing up for that, but it looks like it doesn't have a Heroku deployment for some reason. Well, let's put one in. I'm going to copy the URL here, and then I'm going to do a git push, Heroku. And this is the first push, apparently. Git push Heroku master. All right, now that the application's finished deploying, let's take a look at it. I'm going to use Firefox again, because remember we're looking at this title. And let's go to home. This is static _pages / home. There we go. So we can see the title, Ruby on Rails tutorial sample app, home, and then the right H1. Great, so in this lesson we've covered the basics of static pages in Rails, and in the context of this relatively simple application, we've introduced this idea of test-driven development. We've also introduced along the way quite a lot of Ruby syntax. So the next lesson will involve taking a detour and covering Ruby a little more systematically, especially the kind of Ruby that you need for writing Rails applications.